One of the most well-liked aspects of TTRPGs is Homebrew, original creative content that you can use to individualize your game. 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons in particular has a large, robust Homebrew community. Every day, creators are releasing new settings, rules, and player options for GMs to implement to create their ideal game. Homebrew has played an instrumental role in the best 5th edition games that I've been a part of, both as a GM and as a player. And it's also been part of the worst 5th edition games that I've been a part of, either as a GM or as a player. So how do you know if Homebrew is right for you? Hi, I'm John. This is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming. And today, we're exploring Homebrew and deciding if it's a good fit for you. Let's get into it. Before we tumble too far down the rabbit hole, let's first get on the same page of what we mean when we say homebrew, because it's one of those vague, nebulous terms that means different things to different people. Many times, you'll see the term homebrew used to describe any content that's not created by a TTRPG's first party. While this broad definition also encompasses third-party products, personally, I usually distinguish between third-party and homebrew. To me, third-party products are refined enough that their creators are comfortable selling them for money. Whereas true homebrew, in the way I usually talk about it, is either still in an experimental state or at the very least very unofficial. A great example of understanding this distinction is actually Matt Mercer's World of Exandria. It originally started as this homebrew original setting for just him and his friends. Eventually, it was graduated to a third-party product with the Tal'Dorei campaign setting, and it's actually a rare instance of a third-party product graduating even further into first-party with Explorer's Guide to Wildmount. Although usually I do distinguish between a product being first-party, third-party, or just homebrew, I do want to make it clear that these terms do not automatically guarantee some kind of quality. Wizards of the Coast, D&D's first party, has made a lot of products I love, and also a lot of products I've found meh. Likewise, there's a lot of homebrew I've seen on the internet that is not very good, but every now and again you do find some gems that are incredibly usable and can create some great moments for your table. This, of course, complicates our question, is homebrew right for you? Should you use it? So I started thinking about why someone would use homebrew to begin with, and the answer is to tune their game. Homebrew is used to create a unique experience at your table, whether it's changing the setting, the rules, or both. Now, because of that, for this video only, when I talk about homebrew, I'm really talking about any changes you make to the game's core setting or the game's core rules. And this means that the origin of a change doesn't matter as much. In fact, later on, I'll talk about how facing, which is an optional rule from the Dungeon Master's Guide, it's a first-party piece of content, really changed and revolutionized one of my games. For the purposes of should you homebrew your game, we'll consider that a homebrew rule, even though usually I would consider it just a first-party optional rule. All right. With definitions out of the way, let's move on. Like I said at the top of the video, homebrew has been a big part of the best games I've been a part of, and also the worst. For us to answer our core question, we have to know where homebrew goes wrong. In my experience, homebrew becomes an issue when players have trouble understanding it, remembering it, or if it's unbalanced. And it's all too easy for any of these three things to happen. The benefit to running a rules as written, an unchanged game, is that all players have access to the same content, and it's easier for them to all agree on what the text says, which makes interpretations or judgments a lot quicker too. In terms of rules, your players can prepare by looking up how things work. If they're playing a wizard, they can look up what their spells do. If they're playing a rogue, they can look up an optimization guide so that they can figure out their playstyle. When you make a bunch of changes to the game's rules though, if what you change is inaccessible to your players, like if you're just trying to remember it all in your head, you're obstructing them from adequately preparing for your game, which can cause significant slowdowns later on. Rather than having common text to understand, all the teaching and explanations of the content relies on you, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if your explanations are really wordy or jargony, it's going to create a clunky experience for your players rather than an immersive one. The benefit of running an established setting, like Forgotten Realms or Eberron for 5th edition, is that your players can go out on their own, learn information about the setting, so that they can situate their characters in the world themselves. Again, I'd like to reiterate, the best 5th edition games I've been a part of as a GM or as a player had homebrew settings. But it wasn't the homebrew that made it good. It was who the GM was and how they were able to teach and immerse their players in their custom content. There's just a different excitement that GMs have when they're presenting something that they created on their own, as opposed to just getting it from a source book. So a great question you can ask yourself at this stage is, am I willing to do the work to make this homebrew thing I'm excited about become a reality? Then of course, there's the question of game balance. Game balance is a huge topic I'm not going to really dive into now, and it's an integral part of well-implemented homebrew. You may think something is balanced in theory, but once you see it live at the table, you may discover 3rd or even 4th order consequences you didn't predict that may even ruin the game for some players. Remember that game balance isn't just damage output or armor class. Part of game balance is the real world time that some things take to resolve. For example, one of the early 5th edition games that I was a part of had a player using a custom class. This custom class had a pool of points that this character could spend in order to functionally action surge. I know that some of you are thinking of all the balance implications now. It wasn't even like damage output that was a big concern. It's just that this player's turns took significantly longer to resolve than anyone else's. So combats would typically go like this. The Warlock would Eldritch Blast, roll their beams. The Ranger would shoot 2 arrows. The custom class would fly, attack, move again, action surge attack, cast a low-level spell. You get the point. They weren't necessarily doing more damage or even having a bigger impact on how the combat went. It's just that their turn took a long time to resolve. Now, I'm not sitting here pretending like 5th edition is a balanced game out of the box. It's not. There are several glaring problems with its design, including unclear rules interactions, problematic multi-class builds, and the dreaded Marshal-Caster divide. However, an undeniable benefit of the rules as written is how much other content creators have analyzed it and created a library of content that someone can use to help understand it. Whereas if you're implementing some kind of homebrew rule or homebrew option, the only one that can help a player understand it is you. Alright, that last section was not meant to scare you off, but more to be mindful as you start dipping your toes into the world of homebrewing. Like GMing, I find that the best homebrewers aren't ones that try to dive into the deep end and make all sorts of big sweeping changes to a game, but rather start simple, gain an intimate understanding of the rules as written, and make intentioned adjustments that yield specific experiences. For our purposes, we're going to divide any homebrew changes you make to your game into 3 broad categories: GM changes, system changes, and player options. This also happens to be the order I recommend homebrewing in. GM changes or GM content is anything that's traditionally agreed upon to be in the GM's wheelhouse. This includes the world, NPCs, and monster stat blocks. If you're a new GM and using my 7 baby steps for Masterful GMing, linked in the description below. Even when you're starting a one-shot, I see no reason why you can't situate it in a custom setting. That being said, I do find that GMs creating a custom world can fall into a similar trap. They love their world so much, they can't stop talking about it. Even in the game, they spend so much time conveying their long, verbose environmental descriptions and lore drops and having NPCs interject and having this huge political web of interests and factions that they forget to have their players play. Assuming that you as a GM have the self-control to not just have diarrhea of the mouth, in terms of game balance and accessibility, a homebrew setting is really just set dressing. It doesn't have any mechanical implications, so you don't really have to worry about the game's balance. All your players have to do is remember some of the key points of your world, some specific names of locations or characters. And like any published adventure, part of your job as GM is just to teach your players what the main conflict is and how they can get involved. Mechanically, the biggest GM-controlled homebrew thing that you can play with are custom monster stat blocks. This can range from anything from a completely original monster where you stat out their ability scores and their features, to taking just a generic stat block from an SRD and making a few adjustments, like adding an attack here or just upping an ability score there. The nice thing about monsters is that most tables agree that the stat block is in the GM's purview. Meaning, if you need to make on-the-fly corrections because something is unbalanced, you can, usually without the players knowing. And even then, again, the best homebrewers I know will acknowledge this is a custom monster. Ooh, would it be okay with you guys if I made this adjustment? I didn't realize it would deal so much damage. A lot of times that open and honest communication also builds trust at your table, which is necessary for homebrew to be implemented well. Again, as long as you're not TPKing the players, the worst thing that could happen is the fight is unbalanced one way or another, the players kill your stat block, and you can just move it to the side. It doesn't have the same long-term consequences that something like a system change or a player option might. Now, a few weeks ago, I would have said the next place to move toward would be player options, but then I had an epiphany. System changes are changes to the game's fundamental rules that affect everybody. In other words, they may be problematic from a game balance standpoint, but not a fairness standpoint, because everybody can utilize them, even if their class doesn't specifically take advantage of them. Now, game balance is a more serious concern here. A weird homebrew rule might cause serious confusion or frustration. They're also more difficult to remove once you implement them. So, to go back to custom monsters, again, one-time thing, you try something, it either works well or doesn't, you get some information, and if the party kills the monster, you can just move on. Plugging and unplugging custom rules from the system is more likely to not only cause confusion at your particular table, but if your players participate in games other than yours, it might cause rules confusion kind of all over the place. This is why I find it so important that you're clear what rules are in the core system and what rules are either optional, variant, or homebrewed. Again, to speak to the positive side of system changes, sometimes system changes make your game way more fun. A great example of this is the facing rule from the Dungeon Master's Guide. It's a rule that almost nobody uses, but for my particular table and my particular players, it actually added a whole lot of dynamic decision making. Basically, if you play on a square battle map, at the end of each of your turns, you determine which of the 8 directions your token is facing. If you get attacked from behind, the opposite direction from which you're facing, that attack has advantage. Now, an unexpected consequence I found from this system is that it clarifies line of sight, meaning if you have a rogue who wants to hide as a bonus action, it's much easier to determine if they're in an enemy's line of sight and how easily the hide check can resolve. This makes one of the rogue's iconic tactics a lot more viable. And even for someone like a spellcaster, that might not be making a lot of attack rolls. Because this is a general change, even if they themselves don't interact with the system, they may make choices that help set up another player to take advantage of it. So this is what I mean by system changes being more fair. Now, again, part of game balance isn't just justifying high numbers here or low numbers there. It's understanding how your players mesh with a particular rule. In the game I just described, my players tend to like it, but there are other tables I GM for where I don't bring it up at all because of what the players value out of the game. The key thing for implementing a system change is seeing how it works in play. Unlike a monster, which I think you can pretty safely kind of plug in or plug out, with a system change, I would recommend organizing a one-shot with the players that you see implementing the rule change for. Be ready for them to love it, or hate it, or be ambivalent, and let that guide your decision. When I did this playtest with Facing, I had some players that loved it, some players that were ambivalent, and some players that were skeptical that it would actually add anything. However, even though I didn't get complete 100% delight, I still implemented it because from the GM side of things, it made it easier for me to determine where line of sight was. So although some players thought it was an extra pain to figure out their Facing, it really helped me rule things clearly and in a fulfilling way for my table. Another rule I was thinking about implementing was a Sunder system that I came up with. After seeing it in play a few times, I realized that in its current state, it really was overcomplicated and didn't add a lot to the decision making of my players. So I decided to table it. It wasn't a right time now, but in the future maybe I'll refine it and try a playtest later. Now some of you may be surprised, but the last kind of thing I would consider homebrewing would be player options. Things like magic items, classes, subclasses, species, feats, spells, anything that one player is going to have access to that others aren't. If a player is using custom content and they feel more powerful than their allies, or if it takes them significantly longer to resolve their turns, it'll feel unfair. Especially if it feels like the GM is allowing some players to use custom content and not allowing others. In fact, the reason why I'm putting this last is this is where most of my bad homebrew experiences stem from. Yes, it's a pain when a player doesn't understand a homebrew rule you've implemented or isn't immersing themselves in your homebrew setting. But if it feels like a fellow player is more powerful because of a custom option only the GM allowed them to use, that can really sting. Likewise, if an option is underpowered, it can feel like one player is bringing down the whole party. Even within this category, I do think there are some subcategories of content that you can play with introducing. For example, I find that the easiest player option to introduce are magic items. If you homebrew a magic item and it's too powerful, maybe you find a story reason for that magic item to lose some of its power, or get damaged or stolen. Again, I wouldn't do this without an overt conversation with the player and an admittance that maybe you made something that was too powerful. But I do find that psychologically, a lot of players view their equipment separate from their core character. Editing or taking away a magic item feels different than, say, editing or taking away a class feature or spell selections. In this vein, something I found that worked really well in terms of homebrew player options were just specific what I call gift features. Quick story, in one of my early games as a GM, I had a player who was playing a martial arts character, a monk in 5th edition, and they were also religious. So halfway through the campaign, after part of their story arc had resolved, they met an angel who gave them this magic ability once per long rest to summon wings as a bonus action and fly. It was a little bit of a power bump, but it didn't feel like I was playing favorites because the whole table had experienced how much this one character had gone through, and the power-up felt earned. And also, I wasn't just giving power-ups to this one player. Gradually, I was finding ways to sneak little power bumps to each of the players to honor their individual journeys. In the same way, I find that if you want to introduce a custom spell, it can be gifted in a similar way to these random angel wings. Going in, know that the toughest things to homebrew would be classes and subclasses. Heck, even Wizards of the Coast is doing playtest after playtest for 1D&D, and the community isn't sure if they're getting it right. The only thing I'd say is if you're going to introduce classes and subclasses, I would make it clear what your options are so that all players can choose to play some kind of homebrew option if they wish. If you're not ready to do that, I would shelve that particular homebrew idea until you are ready to allow all of your players to have something cool. So, is homebrew right for you and your table? We've gone over some recommendations and things to consider. I find that asking some follow-up questions may help illuminate the answer for you. Am I willing to do the work to make this homebrew thing a reality? How experienced am I with the rules as written? How strong is my track record for effectively teaching players new things about the game? How concisely can I explain my homebrew? Do I have a tendency to ramble? How well do my players understand the core system? Do they play in other games where the rules can get easily confused? Does my homebrew simplify or complicate the game? Does it add or save time? How much has my homebrew been playtested? How accessible is my homebrew? Has it been written down and shared with my players? Am I ready for my players to say, I don't like this? How okay am I with making mistakes and learning from them? How much trust have I built with these particular players at my table? Let us know your homebrew experiences in the comments down below. Hit like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. And remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.